Hey, welcome to Pastor Chats. Pastor John Cleveland here. Did you see the viral video clip of Wes Huff talking about Joe Rogan, his interview on Joe Rogan? If you didn't see it, let me explain real quickly. Wes Huff was on a podcast with Michael Horton, the Solo podcast, I think it's called. Really awesome video. Link down in the description below. That's four different scholars all talking about textual criticism and really interesting stuff. But at the end of that interview, Michael Horton asked Wes Huff about his famous, 3+ hour long interview that he did on the biggest podcast in the world with Joe Rogan, where he talked openly about the gospel and the Bible. And it was amazing. He did a really good job. And Wes Huff delivered this incredible news that Joe Rogan's actually going to church. And that news just like blew up the internet. Like, are you kidding me? Joe Rogan is going to church. And that's awesome. Hey, let's all start praying for Joe. That's fantastic. But after that, Wes Huff said something even more amazing. Even more amazing. And I have to play this clip for you. Listen to this.
We're seeing what I don't think is an exaggeration to say somewhat of a resurgence in interest in these topics that we've been talking about, even the nitty gritty. We had someone who reached out to us recently at Apologetics Canada, who is probably the last bricks and mortar Christian bookstore that I've ever heard of. But they said, we have people walking through our doors asking, young people, teenagers, saying, I want a Bible. All my friends are reading this thing. Wow. So if the Bible is, becoming popular with teenagers, then something is happening and the Lord is moving.
Mike.
Amen. Something is happening. Let's pray that something is happening. I hope there is a resurgence, just like Wes Huff said. I think Generation Z, honestly, I really hope anyway that Generation Z is opening themselves up and realizing, hey, I've been told about the Bible and I've never read the Bible for myself. So this video is for you, okay? If you're Generation Z or any generation and you're like, I want to crack this thing open. The most famous book ever written, translated into more languages than any other book, more copies than any other book ever written. I've never read it. If you've never read it and you're like, where do I start? Let's talk about that. Because listen, we're talking 66 different books written by over 40 authors over thousands of years on multiple different continents, multiple different literary styles. Where do you begin to read this? It can be daunting. I want to give you some advice. As a pastor, as someone who's been reading the Bible for most of my life now, let me give you some advice that I think will make your reading of the Bible that much more enjoyable and that much more comprehensive. Like, you'll really understand what it's about. Mistake number one in reading the Bible is this: to start at the beginning and just read straight through. Now, listen, if you do that, more power to you. Okay. I mean, that is impressive. I don't think there's a lot of people that can do that, to be honest with you. But the mistake in doing that, and it's not bad if you do it, but the mistake in doing it is that the Bible isn't actually written exactly chronologically. Big portions of it are chronological, but when you read like through the Old Testament, you're going to be jumping around back and forth a little bit, and you're going to be going through multiple literary styles. You're going to be going through historical narrative and poetry and prophecy and apocalyptic literature. And when you get into the New Testament, it's the same thing. You're going to be jumping back and forth a bit. So I don't recommend just reading start to finish. Plus, there are parts of the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, where you will get like bogged down in nitty gritty laws and lists and records, and you're like, mind numbing. Okay, so I don't recommend that, especially if you're brand new to the Bible. Another mistake that I think some people make that I don't recommend is just looking for little pithy sayings, right? Sometimes people will say, my favorite book of the Bible is Proverbs. Now, your favorite book of the Bible can be Proverbs, but don't make the mistake of thinking that the whole Bible is like Proverbs, that it's just little pithy sayings. It's really not. Proverbs is unique in that the Bible is really narrative for the most part. It's telling a story. And that's, I think, where you need to start to understand the Bible. You need to understand the Bible is one grand overarching story. And let me ask you a question, Gen Z, and I bet you know the answer. Who is the main character of this story? I bet you know. If you said Jesus, the Sunday school answer, ding, 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 you're right. Jesus is the central character of the Bible. You have an Old Testament written originally to the Jewish people. You have a New Testament written to the rest of the world, really. And in the center character of both of those is Jesus. The Old Testament is pointing to Jesus. It's pointing to the coming Messiah, and the New Testament is talking about Jesus and about his effect on the world and his effect on his apostles and the teachings of the apostles, which is them relaying the teachings of Jesus. So the central character of the Bible is Jesus, which is why I would say if you're going to read the Bible, the place you need to start is by learning who the main character is. So you need to start with the Gospels, because that's where we really meet Jesus literally in the flesh to begin with. Now, there's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Which one do you read? Which one do you read first? My suggestion to people is always this. If you're brand new to the Bible, read the shortest one first, and the shortest one would be the Gospel of Mark. Okay, I'm gonna like tick these around, and you'll see we'll go through all the different ones as we go. So the Gospel of Mark is the shortest gospel, which means it's not going to take you that long to read. You can literally sit down with it and just read the whole thing in an hour and a half. It's also the first gospel written. Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark, and they obviously read Mark, and they borrowed from him and then added some of their own things about the life of Jesus. And together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call those the synoptic gospels because they're very similar to one another. But Mark is amazing because you're going to meet the person of Jesus. You're going to learn a lot about him. You're going to learn the central stories surrounding him. You're going to see his miracles. You're going to hear his teachings. You're going to hear about the cross and the resurrection. And you're going to get the full story of who Jesus is, right? Now, my suggestion then is you need to read one more gospel. And you need to read the Gospel of John. Okay. Now, why do you need to do that? Well, because John's gospel is very different. One way to think about it is this. If you think about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are gospels kind of written from the bottom up, like from the perspective of man looking up. And the Gospel of John is written top down in that it's written from God's point of view, where John's gospel is really trying to show all the gospels do this, but John's gospel is really trying to show how Jesus is God, his miraculous nature, the way he's fulfilling the role of the Messiah. And John's gospel is also not borrowing too much from the other gospels, and it's obvious that John is writing something just a little bit different, right? And John's gospel also gives us some added stories and details that we don't get in the other gospels. So you'll get a full, robust picture of the main character of the whole Bible if you read Mark and then John, right? All right, now where do you go from there? Well, you know, if I'm reading a novel series and I finish, like a Brandon Sanderson novel or something like that, guess what I want to do? I want to read the next one, right? Because there's never just one Brandon Sanderson book. There's going to be a sequel. And so what is the sequel to the Gospels? Well, that would be the book of Acts. So what happens to those apostles that were following Jesus around? What's the next part of the story? The next part of the story is the book of Acts. Luke, the guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke, he also wrote the book of Acts. It's literally a follow-up. And so, in fact, sometimes scholars will refer to Luke and Acts as one volume, Luke Acts, right? But the Acts of the Apostles is going to show you what the apostles did, their teaching, their understanding of the Gospels. It's going to show you those missionary journeys. And you're really going to get introduced to a couple of central characters in the New Testament, and that is the person of Peter, whom you've already met in the Gospels, and then you're also going to meet that 13th apostle, he's sometimes called, the apostle to the Gentiles, he's sometimes called, and that is Paul. You're going to meet Paul. And Paul is an important figure, really important figure, because he writes the majority of the New Testament and shapes a lot of the theology, the understanding of what Jesus was saying. He shapes that and really fills in the blanks there. And so my suggestion after you read Acts is, now you've gotten the central story of the main character, the follow-up story of the church that is built after Jesus. Now you need to start studying some theology. And this is going to feel daunting, but you can do it. The next thing you need to read is the book of Romans. You need to read the book of Romans. Now, why do you need to read Romans? Romans is really, it's the first theology book. Okay, it is, it's the biggest work of Paul. It's kind of his magnum opus. It gets into what is the nature of sin, what is the nature of justification by faith, of sanctification. It goes into, Paul goes into the Old Testament a little bit and shows us how the whole Bible, even from the Old Testament, has been pointing to Jesus, right? Now, he's not the only writer in the New Testament who does this. So does the writer of Hebrews. But Paul does talk about how Jesus is the second Adam. He talks about Moses and his role and the role of the law in the Old Testament and leading up to. And you're going to get this understanding of that whole Jewish-Gentile connection. Romans is really, really important. Romans is central to understanding the gospel. It's central to understanding the theology of the New Testament. Okay. You've gotten the main character. You've gotten the follow-up story. Now you're getting into the theology. Now where do you go? Well, now that you've kind of seen where the Bible has been pointing to the main character, the main teachings, now I would suggest going back. Now I would suggest, hey, let's go back to the beginning of the Bible and let's kind of fill in the gaps, all right? Because we've created this like structure. Now let's fill in the gaps that have been created. And that would mean going to Genesis and Exodus. So Genesis and Exodus is where you're going to read about the creation of the world. You're going to read about the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You're going to read about Moses. You're going to read about the law of God, the people of God, Israel. You're gonna really important thing you're going to touch on in Genesis and Exodus is the covenants. You're going to read, even from the very beginning of Genesis, about these covenant promises that God makes. And that's really important to understanding the Bible, is to understand the way God deals with humanity is he makes promises to his people. He chooses a people and makes promises to those people, and then he keeps those promises. And ultimately, the fulfillment of all of God's promises, they're all fulfilled in what central character? In Jesus, right? And so that's why I would suggest going back to Genesis and Exodus. You're going to get those promises. You're going to hear how they're made. You're going to understand a little bit more of the law of God revealed to the people. You're going to get that story of Israel and Egypt and getting released from Egypt. That's what the book of Exodus is. All right. Now, right here is where we come to a dilemma. Because the first 5 books of the Bible, it's usually called the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Leviticus, Numbers are very interesting books because Leviticus gets into the law of God, the nitty-gritty laws given to Israel. And Numbers starts off with just these huge, long lists, these like catalogs of people. And if you're brand new to the Bible, honestly, you might start reading those and just fall asleep. You might start reading those and go, what is the point of these? Now, these are important. These are really, really important. But if you're new to the Bible, they're not important just yet, okay? I would suggest, and don't shoot me if you've read the Bible and you're like, this is horrible. No. I would suggest skipping Leviticus and starting Numbers in chapter 9, because the story of Moses with the Israelites gets kind of picked up again in Numbers chapter 9. And read it through the end of the book, then go all the way to chapter 36, and you're going to get this story of the spies getting into you're going to get the story of the Israelites coming up to the promised land of Canaan, and the spies going into the land, and the ramifications of that, and them getting ready. So now you're continuing that story. And the point here is you want to understand the narrative of the Bible before you get into the nitty-gritty of things. If you really understand the overarching story, it's going to be so much easier to understanding the rest of what's going on. So, okay, after you get through the rest of Numbers, now where do you go? You can skip Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a great book, but Deuteronomy, literally the title means second law. It's really a repeat of a lot of the stuff that's you've already read in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and whatnot. It's a repeat of that. So now what you're going to do to continue the story of Israel going into the promised land and what happens when Israel finally reaches what God has been promising to them, you're going to go to Joshua and Judges. Read those together. This is Israel conquering the promised land, them going into the land led by Joshua now. It's going to be the story of Israel getting judged by God for their sin, and God bringing judges in to rescue them from surrounding nations and people. That's the book of Judges. That's where you get, the famous story of Samson and what have you. And so this is going to fill in a lot of that historical narrative and help you really understand what's going on. And from there, to finish that historical narrative, the last books I would say that you need to read are 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, because now Israel, they're going through this tumultuous period of being in the promised land, and they begin to say, hey, we want to be like everybody else. We want to have, kings and be a nation like everybody else. And God says that's a bad idea, but if you want that, let me introduce you to Saul. And so 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings is where we meet the prophet Samuel. We meet those characters of Saul, the king, and then David, and then Solomon, and we get to see the reigns of Israel. We see the kingdom of Israel get split north and south. Once you've done that, all right, so if you're following this, if you've read the Gospels, met the main character of Jesus, the second story, you've gone through some theology with Romans, now you're hearing the story of Israel, God's promises leading all the way up through the book of Kings. Now what do you read? Whatever you want. At this point, I would say read whatever you want. If you're like, man, I want to understand more of the history of Israel and this whole thing, there's the book of Ruth. There's the story of Israel coming out of captivity in Babylon and building the wall and the temple. You've got Ezra and Nehemiah. You can go and read some prophecy if you want to, which is happening during the time of all this Old Testament history. You've got Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel. You can go and read prophecy. If you're like, I just want some poetry, there's Psalms. There's a really thought-provoking book called Ecclesiastes that's really existential and amazing. It's the end of the life of Solomon, and he's writing this existential crisis book called Ecclesiastes. And then you can also get back into the New Testament and start studying some more of those epistles like Romans, the teaching of the apostles to the church, learning how to be a Christian, right? How to live like a Christian. And if you're like, man, I want to jump to the end, I want to understand where this is all going, go to Revelation, right? Read about the future return of Jesus. So that would be my suggestion. This if you're brand new to the Bible, this is the route I would say you need to take first, then go wherever you want. Okay. Hopefully that was helpful to you. Thanks for sticking with me. Hey, I want to invite you to church. If you're, new to the Bible or not new to the Bible, and you're looking for a place to worship, come join us Sundays, 10:30 a.m. We've got our worship service. Would love to have you if you're in the Atlanta area. We're in McDonough, faithmcdonough.com. You can find us there. But listen, hey, have had so much fun with you. I hope you have an amazing, blessed day. And hey, crack open your Bible. Read it today. God bless.